Welcome to a supplemental episode of Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. Andrew Rein, president of the Citizens Budget Commission, has joined me to go into a little more detail about the New York State budget, as well as our city and state's fiscal condition. And so now, let's recalibrate reality with Andrew Rein. Andrew Rein, welcome to Recalibrate Reality.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I appreciate it. So, Andrew, this week we have New York State Senate Majority Leader Andrew Stewart Cousins joining us. And they obviously this recently passed the state budget and a lot more. And I wanted to use this conversation to give our viewers sort of a primer about what's in the state budget, how it impacts their life, the programs, the city, the municipalities they live in. And I figured no one better than you, who runs the Citizens Budget Commission, to share some of your insights, because obviously you live and breathe in this world. So thank you very much. So maybe to get started, just for those who don't know, maybe just give a minute or two about the Citizens Budget Commission specifically.
Well, the Citizens Budget Commission was started after the city's fiscal crisis going back to 1932. So we've been in this business a little while, and we expanded our purview to the state in 1985, really to focus on the finances and services in New York City and New York State, not only what good policies and programs and management help New Yorkers today, but also in the future. So we do take a long run view, as well as the activities that should happen today. We have 150 trustees who make our policies with the research staff, and that's how we operate, as we have for decades.
So let's jump to today. Let's maybe take a few minutes and talk about the sort of fiscal condition of the state and city pre-COVID, and then some of the things that happened that impacted us a year ago, and what we thought sort of where we were heading with in terms of the budget challenges because of COVID.
Certainly. If we spin back the clock, I don't know, what is it, 15 months ago, we had a 10-year recovery, really strong. We added in the city a million jobs. Revenues were strong. So, from the city budget side, during that recovery, the city budget had grown $25 billion on an annual basis with city funds, $30 billion including federal and state funds. And then the state budget had grown as well. The challenge on both sides with these strong tax revenues was, prudent fiscal management. Reserves were lower than they should be, about $5 to $6 billion in both the city and the state, and they probably should have been double that.
So we had really strong growth, wind at our back going into this crisis. We had some liabilities that we had pushed forward that we were going to have to deal with within the budget, but we had a strong economy, high income growth to deal with that. So then COVID hits, and everything that we thought was going to be the things that we were going to have to address changed overnight. And so when you think back to that, 15 months ago, 12 months ago, what did you imagine the circumstance would be as we entered this budget cycle that just passed last week?
First of all, there's so much uncertainty. No one had ever seen a recession like this. Usually it kind of creeps up on you a little too fast, but you see it coming. Job losses are slow, revenue losses, declines are slow, but we had to shut down the economy to fight the pandemic, which of course drove us right into a recession. And this was a recession and a shutdown that hit the heart of what makes New York strong. We are an interactive, creative, density-driven economy, certainly downstate. Plus tourism, entertainment, nightlife, everything that makes New York great had to be shut down, which was devastating. So the nature of the recovery, the nature of the recession was very tough. Then the state and the city projected revenue losses. Over 4 years, $62 billion revenue shortfall on the state was projected, and a $19.5 billion revenue shortfall over 4 years the city was projected. So, we went in saying, the bottom's falling out on the economy, the bottom's falling out on revenues. And the really challenging parts was that there was no proactive plan to address this. Primarily, the plan was the feds need to come and save the day. Now, listen, the feds kind of did. So we're lucky. We had a recession that was tough, a revenue shortfall that was tough, and a lack of a strategy on both the city and the state going into this, which was very much worrisome because we the uncertainty ahead, there was dark clouds. They'd already hit us. We didn't know what it would look like, and we weren't really taking the actions we needed to.
Yeah, and when you think about it, it was sort of like the worst of all worlds, right? We had this public health crisis, loss of revenue, increase in expenses because we needed to rely on government to help provide support during this public health crisis, and support to provide that social safety net that you typically would have. I mean, I guess as you look back on it, one could argue that was not the time to try to go deep in austerity until we had some better visibility as to where things were going in the future, right? And we did get some big breaks in terms of Washington becoming more friendly, Senator Schumer becoming our Senate Majority Leader and delivering for New York, and a more of a V-shaped economic recovery, at least on the surface, relative to income taxes and sales taxes that people had expected.
You're exactly right. The nature of the recession and recovery were very different than originally projected. When I talked about those revenue shortfalls, people were looking at business taxes and personal income taxes and assuming, hopefully that the city's property tax would be stable. And in fact, it flipped around. Some industries, this K-shaped recovery did pretty well. Wall Street did pretty well. And so when the state projected a $62 billion revenue shortfall, it turned out that it was only 29 billion, but still it was less than half of what originally projected. And in fact, in the near term, better than that. And then the city, what happened was the revenue shortfall is still about the same. It's a little worse, but the city has increased its estimate of business and personal income taxes by about $1 billion a year. But based on property values, a projection of decline overall of 5% decline in property values, which is stunning in the city then reduced its estimate of property tax revenue by $2.5 billion a year. This is a stunning example. First of all, it's fiscally stunning. It also represents what's happening with people not being able to pay rent on the residential market, commercial market, retail. So it's kind of represented the economy and how it hits the city fisc.
Right. So if you think though into going into this budget negotiation that just got completed, right? The state of the fiscal circumstance shrunk a lot, right? So for New York State, I guess there were some estimates that the gap that at the time that this budget needed to be passed was somewhere between, I heard, as low as $9 billion, as high as $15 billion. Maybe it's $12 billion, I guess, depending on what you look at in that regard. And there was obviously challenges in local municipalities, school districts, healthcare systems that had to react to COVID, and which greatly increased their costs and also reduced some of their revenue. So we had a lot of services that there were holes in as well, right? So here comes the cavalry with Chuck Schumer leading the way, and we fill that gap, right? So was there, in your mind, was most of that gap filled for the state and the municipalities that needed the support?
Just stepping back for a second, by the time the budget was adopted in April 7th or whatever the date was, I can't, they were voting over so many days as we watched this. The state actually, over a 2-year period, this year and next year, had $22 billion more in resources than when the governor had proposed his budget in January. He had increased revenue estimates $1.6 billion a year in his 30-day amendments. Multiply that by 3 years, last year, this year, next year. There was, in the consensus revenue forecast with the legislature, another $2.5 billion identified. So suddenly that wipes out a lot of that gap. Plus the American Rescue Plan, $12.6 billion of unrestricted aid. The governor had assumed 6, so it's another $6.6 billion. So $12.6 billion in American Rescue Plan aid, $9 billion to flow through the state to school districts, another $1.5 billion in unrestricted aid for Medicaid. So we actually had $22 billion more going into figuring out how to adopt this budget than when the governor had proposed it in the middle of January.
And of course, this New York City and the other municipalities got their fair share as well.
Yes, I mean, and the numbers for some municipalities are pretty stunning compared to their budgets. The key for all the governments is to use this federal money wisely. You can either use it to help as a bridge, or you can pump up your spending base and you're going to be sunk in a couple of years. So that's part of the name of the game now. But New York City from the American Rescue Plan will get about $6 billion in unrestricted aid. And we shouldn't discount the FEMA 100% match, another thing delivered from Washington. So the city came in with more resources than it expected. Plus, as I said, that American Rescue Plan education aid, $4.5 billion is flowing to the city. I think maybe a little more than that is flowing to the city. So the city is in much better shape than it would have projected as well.
So as you're talking, there's sort of two things that come in mind. One is never waste a crisis, which it feels like, to your point, we wasted some of this crisis to make some tough decisions that would set us up structurally stronger in the future. You now have these funds coming in that you didn't expect to get. What do you do with these funds, right? And then, and maybe for people to have a better understanding, take a step back, right? This is $212 billion budget. How large is that compared to past budget? I know it's a record budget. And how much of the dollars in that budget that are being allocated now to social issues are sustainable dollars, recurring revenue versus one-time revenue? And then lastly, maybe if we could talk about the revenue generators that were used to actually escalate the budget.
$212 billion, including all the federal funds, is an $18 billion increase from last year, which was a $21 billion increase from the year before. So really, over 2 years, we're up $39 billion. Now, smartly, I will say, and we'll see again how it plays out over time, some of that money that the state is giving to school districts, it says you have to spend over time, which is smart, which is wise. The state is saying use some of it for one-time needs, for learning loss and getting kids back to school. And there's a lot of that. And this is a great opportunity because kids have been some of the biggest victims of this crisis in that way. But they're also saying you can build some of it into your base, which is the risk you're talking about. But the budget is really, it's not only a record budget, it is a huge budget, without question, supported by that federal money and the tax increases.
So let's hit the tax increases. First, let's ask the question, if there weren't any tax increases, would we have been able to have a balanced budget, and what would have been sacrificed?
There is no question that we would have been able to have a balanced budget. We increased the budget, as I said, $18 billion, $3.2 billion is of the tax increases. Maybe it's $3.7 billion, sorry, is the tax increases. If we had increased it 15 billion, it would have been enough to balance the budget. As we said, these numbers, are nothing close to what was needed. We had 22 billion more in resources available. The question is, how much more would we have given to school districts? How much more would we have given to Medicaid given this? And again, we need to see the financial plan. But those revenue raisers are 4.3 billion between the personal income tax cuts and the tax increases and the corporate tax increases. So that's what's kind of bolstering the base over time. But we certainly could have balanced the budget and with the federal aid had enough time to restructure our spending, which is what we really need to do, especially even because some of this federal aid is going to be built into the base. And when that goes away, it's one-time money. What we can see right now is, I'm guessing around $1.6 billion a year of school spending is going to be built into the base of school aid spending that'll go away in a few years.
Right, and you mentioned earlier, for example, that we had an imbalance in Medicaid spending. Has that been resolved in this, or is that something else that's going to rear its head as we get to the other side of this?
It's exactly the right question. Just stepping back, if I can say, last year's budget, the governor revived his Medicaid redesign team, said we need to save $2.5 billion a year. They came up with a plan to save $1.5 billion a year. Still that shortfall. What we have seen in this pandemic is obviously laid bare the disparities of our health system and the fact that its lack of coordination actually can cost people's lives and can affect them. But what we also know is we had an underlying spending problem that predated the pandemic and that we've got to come back to, because we do need to reduce those or eliminate those disparities, be fiscally sustainable, be more coordinated. If we've learned nothing else in this pandemic that we need to take planning for the future, it's that.
Right. So on these revenue generators, they're driven by tax increases, and we wanted to spend a couple minutes talking through the tax increases, right? And I think, fundamentally, there has been a general belief that people that do well should help people that are doing less well, and I'm a believer in that. And I think there's two problems though, that need to be thought about when you're generating public policy around that principle, right? The first problem is when is raising taxes too much that we lose the group of taxpayers that have effectively been subsidizing the scale of our budget because they've been paying these higher taxes because they've been doing well. And I mean, I think there's a number of something like the millionaires of our state pay 44% or something of our taxes. When did they start moving to Florida? When did they start moving to Texas? The second area that I want to focus on, which we'll go back to, is when we raise taxes, how is that money ultimately spent, and is it spent responsibly? But let's take the first one, because that's the one I think that people, and when I speak to state legislatures, they have a hard time understanding it, right? They say, well, the millionaires are doing well. What is that number, and what percent of these high net worth people could decide to just continue working remotely from Florida or Texas or wherever they are and not come back to New York and throw off our entire balance of our budget?
People need to realize there is, on one side, people say the sky is falling. And on the other side, that everyone will leave tomorrow. The other side, people say it'll never happen. The reality is, it's not that the sky is falling, it's that we're chipping away at our economic foundation. We're making it more expensive. And the evidence shows there is some, tax sensitivity. Frankly, wealthy people move less than other people because they don't have to. But there is some sensitivity to taxes. But the evidence is not about our current situation, which is we're vaulting to the highest income tax rate in the country. We have the SALT cap still, as the governor has said. It's all, it's assumed that SALT cap will go away. That's a, I'm not sure if it's an optimistic assumption, but it's certainly an assumption right now. We also have the experience of the last year. We say, look at all these people, they've done well. Well, a lot of them have done well telecommuting or running businesses. Do we need to give them a reason not to come back? And then it's subtle. People change their domicile at this income level. They spend however many 160 days here or whatever. Changing those number of days can actually change whether you're a full-time resident, pay income tax on all your income, or suddenly you're a non-resident paying taxes on only part of your income. Or even if you're in New York State but not living in the city, you've been telecommuting. Why do I have to come back from Westchester or Connecticut or Long Island? These are all reasons that we don't need to give people right now to leave New York, because they can have a deleterious effect.
Yeah, I mean, you look at New York right now, right? You're sitting here, and office buildings have occupancy of 10% or less, and everyone's working to try to make New York attractive, to be magnetic to come back. And to your point, so many, and particularly of the high net worth affluent executives, have learned that they can work remotely. And to the extent that they continue to work remotely, it really could throw off this balance. I've heard numbers as low as 100,000 people sort of make up that 1 or 2% of our budget. And to the extent that starts dissipating, and those people, as you point, start shedding and saying, you know what, I'm not going to have to spend 52% of my every dollar I earn on taxes like a Western European country. I'm going to live someplace else. What ends up happening, and I think this is the part people have the hardest time getting their head around, is that our budget doesn't shrink. The same cost structure is there, but we need now to turn to the normal individual New Yorker who's earning less than $1 million to pay higher taxes to be able to pay for that same budget, because we're not going to see budget cuts, right? And the services aren't going away. And all those people that you mentioned earlier that were hired aren't going to be terminated. So this is the challenge that I think that imbalance that people have a hard time getting their head around.
Our portion of the nation's millionaires between 2010 2018 decreased 17%. So people are choosing, and then it's even a greater decline in terms of people shifting from non-resident taxpayers in the state from resident taxpayers to non-resident taxpayers. So if we keep that percentage steady, we can keep the money flowing. That's what people don't realize. It's a lost money. It's not that the revenues are going to go down tomorrow because everyone left. It's chipping away at the foundation. When we want those people here, we want the businesses here, we want the tax revenue here, because yes, New Yorkers have needs and desires for services, and we should manage them well, but we should support the needs that New Yorkers have.
Yeah. And the only now caution is that because of this post-COVID environment that we live in right now, which has really changed the paradigm of everything, the ability to really think about people deciding whether they're going to actually stay or not, or come back or not, is different than any of the stats you've looked at historically, right? You can't use that to judge, that you can't use the past experience to judge what's going to happen in the future. And this is what's so concerning about this increase right now. And we're not going to see it, as to your point, tomorrow, but it could be a year and 2 years from now. And, it sets us up as a state for some major challenges that we're going to have to address.
What you've done by this tax increase is not driven people away tomorrow, but you've increased the cost of doing business here. The state has now increased the price of goods to the extent it's passed along, and having it more, we're already in an expensive place. Increasing the cost of doing business here in the long run is not helpful. Certainly when we're already number one in corporate taxes, and that's again chipping away at that foundation.
And there's perception issues, right? I think that's the other piece where perception becomes reality. So when you see headlines as, New Yorkers now particularly people who live in New York City, the highest payers of taxes in the state, and some potentially in the Western world, and you see at the same time headlines of declining quality of life or increasing in crime, these all add up to make it less attractive, less magnetic, which has been, the ingredient that has driven our success over the last couple of decades that you spoke about earlier. And so that's the challenge. And I think the other point that you raised, which is key, and I want to reemphasize, is these are real challenges. The social issues and the programs that are being put in place to deal with education, to deal with homelessness, to deal with poverty, to deal with the overall income inequality are problems that need to be addressed by society. But pitting one state against the other is a race to the bottom.
No, I think very much, and that's about prioritizing what you do, making sure your spending is efficient, making sure your policies, are the right policies and focus on the right things. So think about, what makes New York, city and state great. You want great education. You have to focus on quality education, which doesn't necessarily mean more money. It's how it's allocated and having performance standards for that. It's about unleashing the ability to produce more housing in the downstate region especially. There are other states that have more encouragement for what's called transit-oriented development in the suburbs, but we have, we don't have those carrots and sticks, and our property tax system slows housing production, our zoning system slows it. We actually are producing less housing than our competitor states, and so we need more diverse housing. So it's education, housing, public health, public safety, sanitation. These are the things you have to get right, which we can do if we actively manage it. It won't happen sitting back, though. That's really the challenge.
Yeah, right. And when you look at again, in the post-COVID world, every private sector has realized that the playbooks of the past are just that, of the past. They're not going to work today, and they're not going to work tomorrow. And it feels like to me that when you think about the state government and the city, that we're still trying to play off the old playbook, which is we have these social problems. Let's put money towards those social problems. Most of people, including myself, say, I don't have a problem paying more taxes. What I have a problem is that the money's not going to solve the problem, right? I mean, government has a responsibility to help address these challenges, but they also have a responsibility to do it responsibly. And New York City. You look at it and you think about when Mayor de Blasio was inaugurated back in 2013, the reality was his budget was $68 billion. And imagine at the time if someone came to him and said, listen, we believe in your tale in two cities. We're going to increase that budget by $22 billion. Yet we still have the challenges of homelessness. We still have the challenges of affordable housing. We still have the challenges of public safety, the cleanliness, and so it's this inefficiency, right? I mean, yeah, I think we give them credit and credit's due on dealing with pre-K education, but besides that, you look around and you say, what did we get for the $22 billion that we spent? And I think that's the skepticism that makes the public in general really anxious when they hear about tax increases and increasing state budgets or city budgets without the discipline and plans and policies and transparency to see that they're going to be accountable on how they spend that money.
I think you're exactly right. Listen, pre-K and the rollout so far of 3K, these are really important issues. The right to counsel, that so the people who are getting evicted can have representation. There's definitely disagreements about the policy, but it's been somewhat effective. It's certainly reduced before the pandemic, reduced evictions. There is a question whether those same people are going to have episodic income problems and just going to come back. But there have been a couple of things, but the perspective has been additive. We want a new program, let's add it. We want a new program, let's add it. It's not saying, how do we prioritize? Prioritization is about adding and de-emphasizing things. And efficiency, as I said, there are plenty of opportunities. I mentioned, sanitation. There are plenty of opportunities, big as well as marble, throughout city government, but it hasn't been the focus of this administration, which is the missed opportunity, as well as you said, accountability. We need a performance management system at the state. I mean, people were heartened when the governor was in the beginning of the pandemic talking about the data every day, but that didn't really evolve as the pandemic evolved. But you need performance management at the state, which is almost totally absent, and you need to actively do it in the city.
And as this budget unfolds and we get more details over the next 2 weeks, as you described earlier, will some of these programs potentially have performance milestones that are going to need to be met before there's funding and monitored, or is it really just more of how it's going to be allocated?
I mean, the state has said you can use half the money for one time, half the money for recurring spending in terms of the education aid from the federal government. So it'll monitor that. But with all this money given, it will not necessarily monitor the results. And education, as I said, is not only the most important, it's one of the two huge chunks of the state budget. There's a recurring baseline that's unaffordable being built in with the federal money. Plus, we give around $2 billion a year to well-off school districts that already fund what the state guarantees in its constitution, as calculated by the state education department, as a sound basic education. That's one of the structural problems. We not only don't have accountability, we're throwing more money at school districts that don't need it when there are other districts that do need it that aren't getting enough.
Yeah, it's interesting as you speak. You think we really missed an opportunity over the last decade where we had this record level of job growth, population growth, tourism, and economic vitality within the state and the city, of not finding ways to use that moment of prosperity to address some of these structural fiscal problems. And then here we hit COVID, where now our city's as exposed as it's ever been, probably, in its life, if not at least, multiple decades and generations. And rather than trying to focus on growing our way out of this, we're now adding another layer of inhibitants in the form of cost of living and taxes that are out there. So it's challenging.
It is challenging. I think one of the challenges is the incentive system, right? When times are good, you can just do good things and it's easy. When times are bad, you're fearful. What's interesting about this moment with the federal aid is we actually have the runway to do those structural changes. The risk is that runway just feels like relief and we don't take those actions that we need to. But now is that pivotal time that we could really set ourselves up for the strong future. So we don't sit here, in the middle or at the end of the next recession and say, well, we didn't have reserves and we spent too much money. We've had this conversation before. Let's try to actually fix it this time. And it's really that pivotal time. And if I just may say, in terms of what I think is the natural experiment, think about open streets in the city and restaurants. Think about how government would have decided, we think this is a good idea. Let's study it for 18 or 24 months. Let's have a 12-month pilot design. Let's have all the political controversy and then shelve it. This is just an incredible experiment. What can we learn? Not only for this, but what can we learn about government turning on a dime and being active? It could be a wonderful time.
Yeah, and I think it's true. This is a moment that you need bold policies and you need to be recalibrating for what the future is. And this should be a reset moment of what the world was pre-COVID is going to be very different post-COVID. And so we should be, providing policies directed to that post-COVID world rather than being tethered to the past policies that have proven not to necessarily be effective in the current environment, which sets up for my final question for you, right? So we have in New York City, the mayoral race coming up, the primary in June, likely leading to our next mayor. assume that the mayor-elect, he or she, reaches out to you and says, we have this budget, all the things that we talked about. I'd like you to advise me and tell me, or what would the priorities be, the 3 or 4 priorities that I should be thinking about in terms of creating a New York City budget that recalibrates for COVID, that positions the city for a more sustainable, more equitable, more prosperous future for as many of its citizens as possible.
First, spend the federal money wisely. This is one-time money. Use it as a bridge, either to restore cuts that you wouldn't have had to make, or for these one-time needs like the learning loss, like our kids, and other counter-cyclical economic needs of New Yorkers, which I think we have to remember has been radically reduced by the American Rescue Plan, the biggest program in 75 years, the state budget, biggest, and I don't know, I can't go back in that history. So there are fewer and fewer needs, but focus, use the federal money wisely over a few years as that bridge and to focus on needs. Second, manage your finances and operations well. Put money in a rainy day fund, continue to find savings every year, efficiency savings that are recurring so you can get your operations. We have the runway to do it. So finance and operations, including performance management. Then focus on key policy and operational priorities. Education, get it right. Housing production, get it more. Work on NYCHA, get it managed well. Fund fair fares so that people can ride the subway to work if they don't have the income. There are a core set of those that will make it an equitable recovery. And then the basic services, public safety, sanitation, for example, we need to do well as well as public health. Then, as I said, leverage this economic experiment. Identify these lessons learned. Now is a golden opportunity. We don't do it enough in society. Now is the time for government to do that. And frankly, all this, and I will say there's still talk in the city of people raising taxes. I think we've had enough. I worry about where we are with the state tax increases. We have enough money, and if you do these other things, federal money wisely, manage the operations, manage the fisc, focus on key priorities that will help an equitable recovery, we do not need to raise taxes, and we'll be more stable in the long run. And more stability helps New York's government help its people. That's what people have to remember. Dislocation of finance means dislocation of people. Stability means the ability to help people.
I think people underappreciate the interconnected ecosystem that is New York City, right? In terms of the 60 million tourists that had come here in the past, or downtowns flourishing, driving our restaurants and our small businesses, or to your point, if real estate tax values are declining, what that means long-term in terms of the structural fiscal stability of our city, or our education system providing an ability to make our communities more attractive and our future citizens more productive. So, these things are all connected. And as we recalibrate reality for the future, I think, it's going to be critical that we're thinking for the long term and not for the short term. And I think that's your point about making sure that we spend that federal funding wisely as an investment, not a Band-Aid, because we don't need the Band-Aid anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And the one thing we haven't probably touched on enough is the leadership to bring the public, private, nonprofit, labor sectors all together. We are not only is our economy and our fisc and the city, state, and the MTA and the world connected, but the different sectors of the economy are connected and need to work together. And we do have a common goal in fundamental ways, but we need to work on common activities and rebuild that social compact. Not everyone's going to get the perfect world that they want, but actually together, people can get what they need: housing, jobs, growth, excitement, dynamism. That's what New York's about, but it is about coming together for that.
Let's hope that becomes a reality, and that becomes the Recalibrate, the new reality for New York, because that's a great vision. If we could find that public-private partnership and create a level of vitality as you described. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing your insights and educating us about this fairly opaque budget process and what lies ahead.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Hopefully, this supplemental episode provided helpful insights on the New York State budget, as well as our city and state's fiscal condition. Thank you, Andrew Rein of the Citizens Budget Commission, for sharing your expertise. Thank you to the Regional Plan Association and the 92nd Street Y. And thank you to the team for pulling this together. From 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York, I'm Scott Rechler.